That's right, folks. After taking some time away to visit family, this is how I return to Zwift by jumping into the climb portals and on my way to earning my DD costume or DD kit, as it were. And so here we go on climb 2 of 4. And yes, I did do this right before a race. So I got done with this, figured it's 23 minutes and change. And so, including a few minutes coming back downhill, I looked at the time and I was like, I've got just the right amount of time before the next Allez race starts. And so I figured, why not? It was basically a nice warm up for this race. Jumped onto the SL8 and kept the DT Swiss 65s on to basically see how they feel, because it's the first time I actually raced with them. And so I saw in the chat someone's like, basically it was like, oh, group ride to the top. And that was, in my mind, the cue to, push as hard as I can. Now, granted, again, I just came off a 23-minute climb. Not a lot of, it wasn't a hard climb. It was for like 300, 400 something meters. So not a difficult climb, but really not the way to put your best foot forward when it comes to entering a race that you want to make, improve your GC standings on. And so as we get going here, I, push harder off the front. I'm not going blazing fast, but in the mid threes. I figured I was doing that on the climb, so why not just kind of push off the front doing that as well. Didn't really expect anybody to follow the follow and push hard. I figured people would just kind of leave me on the front and just stay on my wheel, which is kind of what happened there. So I will jump forward in this race. And so as we start to hit the first cobbles here in a few seconds, the pace little by little starts to pick up speed. You see my power come up to mid 200s. We're just kind of cruising there for a little bit. And of course, people, when I feel like there's this unwritten rule of like when you hit the cobbles, you got to push hard. Obviously, there's you get a little bit of a, extra resistance on the cobblestones, so you're naturally going to push a little bit harder. But as you can see, the pace really started lighting up in the front. People hitting above 3 watts per kilogram and pushing forward, and I had to push myself just to keep up, just to stay with the pace. I didn't want to drop too far off the front, and I see these two guys riding off the front, and so I wanted to make sure that I made that gap and stayed with them, because even though, again, I just came off a climb, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like I can, like I can still race and participate. And so my goal is, as always, to stay on the front and just really, work my experience on the front of the group. Now, as we get through this next set of cobbles, the pace didn't pick up much on this set of cobblestones here. But as we start to cross the line, you see a couple guys again pushing off the front. Everyone's starting to use their power ups. I had a feather, which really didn't. I figured I'd hold on to the feather until I hit a real climb, versus using the feather for the sake of using the feather. And so you see a couple guys are pushing a little bit harder off the front again, and so I'm just doing my best to kind of hold that wheel and make sure that I stay as competitive as possible, being close to the front. Now, as we hit the base of the climb, this is basically the beginning of the end for me. Now, I stay with the group, and right now I'm doing, roughly about 3.5, 4 watts per kilogram, just kind of holding it together. Now, one thing I didn't mention before is that coming out of a family, vacation, I put on quite a bit of weight. I jumped up to about 88 kilograms. And so this extra weight, while it felt good for the climb portal, it was not feeling good right now. So as you can see, I'm starting to get distance, And, these guys are really starting to pull away on me. And basically, they're out of sight now. They're 15 seconds ahead, 16 and climbing. And so at this point, my focus is just getting through the climb as best as possible. Still trying to maintain a decent power. I don't want to fall too far behind because, again, this is a race. And ultimately, when it comes to the monthly racing series for Zwift, especially if you're going to go for GC standings, it doesn't matter what place you get. What matters is how fast you finish the race. And so if you're going out for GC, you need to finish the race as fast as possible. And so as you can see, I'm, here at the top of the climb, I use my feather really at the almost perfect timing because it finished right as I got to the top. And as I get to, this almost flat section, I was absolutely exhausted. Heart rate climbed into the 180s for sure. It's starting to come back down right now as I'm soft pedaling through the, through this little false flat to the downhill. And I look at the race profile and realize I've got a long way to go, an absolutely long way to go. And that took an emotional toll on me for a second there because I was already in a lot of pain. I put myself through a lot of pain going through the climb portal first and then jumping into a race like this. I should have paid attention to the stage because this being a longer stage meant that the energy that I used while I was on the climb portal, I basically could have saved that and just did this race instead. But oh well. Those are some of the lessons learned. So I take a quick swig of my energy drink to kind of recoup and get back at it. The last 400 meters now, I do get pretty close to the person in front of me within, 25, 22 seconds of them, which I was really pushing as hard as I can. Their lead was much further out, but I was able to close that gap some. As you can see, the person behind me is about 4.5, minutes or so back, 4 minutes 20 back. And so I knew they weren't going to catch me. So I was just doing my best to kind of, catch the rider in front of me. But ultimately that didn't happen, especially as we hit these last 100 meters or so on the cobblestones. And so I gave a push. I wouldn't even call it a sprint. It looks like I'm sprinting, but really it's just a push because it's all I had left. And I crossed the line in 12th place. There we go, 12th place, which, it was what it was. Cross the line, 43 minutes. I don't really feel good about it when it came to the GC standings because I figured that would really set me back. But ultimately, the next race that I did for this series may have changed that. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so I'm jumping way forward on this one. This is DW19. So as you guys know, on Thursdays I do TTTs. For the summer, I've been doing morning and evening TTTs in order to help improve my fitness. And so I'm on DW19 in the mornings and DW9 in the evenings. And so DW19 is more of a, it's supposed to be more of a leisure ride, given that it's a Mocha team and, it's 7 a.m. It's an early ride. I'm pushing through. So I'm on 10th gear because my virtual shifting started having issues and ultimately, just couldn't deal with it. So I was basically stuck in 10th gear the entire race. So I have essentially no choice to push as hard as I can up the climbs in order to maintain my pace. Now, 10th gear is not exactly good for sprinting. But again, this is supposed to be a chill ride. We've got, some really strong guys in this group. But again, it's a Mocha team. So we don't really push beyond like 3.5 watts per kilogram on the flats. And so as we start to get to, over the rollers, our main DS lets us know like, hey, I'm cooked. Don't worry about me. If I remember correctly, he was going to race in the evening too, which in this case, I wasn't racing in the evening this time. And so I didn't, I wasn't worried about, what the finish looked like. And as soon as he gave us the, hey, go ahead guys, just, finish strong. you'll see it was almost like a call to action. So you see, a couple of people, fly by me, and then all of a sudden I realize like, oh, they're gonna, they're not gonna hold back for this finish, and I'm number 4. I'm the 4th person that needs to cross the line, and so I, as I've heard before, put it in B for boogie, and did my best to catch up to them because they were gone. They took off like a rocket, and as you see the flame socks going, they were pushing hard. I started pushing harder. And this ultimately became an exercise of, can I get my RPMs as high as I can to not only keep up with them, but make sure that I wasn't so far back that I put us in a bad position for being the 4th rider across the line. And so I start to catch up to Sam there and just basically push myself through, because again, we have our 2 riders off the front that I wanted to make sure I was as close to them as possible. And I know Sam was, essentially on my tail as well. And so as we get through the downhill, I'm just spinning, spinning as fast as I can, hitting up to 100, 100-ish RPM. You can see my watts are low right now because we're going downhill. But as soon as we hit that flat, I know I need to push it and push it hard because they were gone. Like they were not waiting for anybody. Which again, this is, the morning TTTs are not like, we're not competitive. We're not looking to take first place or anything like that. It's usually the evening TTTs that are more competitive. So, we weren't worried about, the specific time. I just didn't want to be far behind them, when we came across the line. And as you can see on my background, I got the Tour de France going. So that was motivation for me to get across. And you see, I start to launch my sprint, and man, I was watching my watts. I'm like, I'm almost at 500 watts and just crossed the line of 500 watts, getting up to, almost 560 watts, doing 125 RPM, which I can tell you, I've never, ever, ever, ever done those kind of RPMs. So it really was a good training ground for me to push those kind of RPMs, and get a pretty decent wattage out of it. And so I'll definitely be practicing that more because it is something that will help me in the future with my sprinting. But for now, that is where our TTT was at. And so moving on to stage number 3 for Allez. When I saw this person, Jay Guerrero, put in the chat, seems like an easy course, my first thought was famous last words. And so as you can see by the pink jersey and the ponytail, we got Mike Bell in the pen. We've got JD in the pen. This was the first time that I've gotten to ride with JD in a while. And so I was super excited about being in the same pen with him. Got Mike Bell in the pen, got Darren in the pen, got Jail in the pen. We've got a lot of guys that are in the Pain Inc. In JD's Discord or on Dirt. And so, it was going to be fun. And that was kind of the, Mike and I were like, hey, let's push 4.5 watts per kilogram off the front from the get-go. And that's exactly what we did. As you can see, he's on the front. I'm pushing up to catch up to him. And so when that person put in the chat, that seemed like an easy course, I was like, well, it might be an easy course, but we're going to make it hard. We're going to make it as difficult as possible and push as hard as we can. Now I'm in the 450 to 570 pen. I'm on the cusp of my score came down a bit, especially with that last stage for the Allez. My score came down to 533. And so, this is the appropriate pen for me, but I do like racing in the, A pen category. I was trying to do that primarily because Zwift Power, the way it organizes it by pen. And so depending on range 1, range 2, if you're racing in your appropriate category on range 1, I believe it is, for me, it puts me in the A category, and on range 2, it puts me in the B category. So here I go again, attacking off the front and, just giving myself a little push. And basically my strategy behind the attacks on this stage was I'm going to push for about 5-ish seconds and then ease off. I wanted to see who was going to follow. I wanted to see if people were going to, make the push themselves. And ultimately, because Mike was in the pen, because JD was in the pen, Those two specifically, I wanted to make sure that I worked for them as hard as I can. You see Mike going off the front again. You see this person Lasher, pushing off as well. And, so I wanted to make the race difficult for as many people as possible in hopes that, basically Mike and JD get are able to just basically coast with the group. And I will be the one that, causes people to use their power ups or burn themselves out. And so the last little bit, JD can push on the sprint, or Mike can push on the sprint. Now there is a little bit of an uphill on this course. We are on the Champs after all. And so as we, push through the tunnel here, I fully expected everybody to push hard through the tunnel. That was really where I felt like was going to be the most challenging. And so there is a guy that ends up, kind of spinning up and pushing harder. But ultimately, we haven't even really hit the official start of the laps. And, you can see my flame socks again going because I am pushing up and over on this, coming out of the tunnel here. And again, you see JD's off the front right now, but, still kind of coasting at this point. And so I'm just going to continue to jump forward to the next major point in this race. Now, as we went up and around the Arc de Triomphe, you see that, we just kind of coasted and I stayed together with the group, but I knew there was this part coming up where it was downhill and then a slight uphill and then back down. And so that's where I chose to launch another attack, because I knew as we hit this 1% hill, a lot of people are going to lose momentum. You see Mike also launched, attack coming up behind me. You see another rider came up behind him. And so we're, 4 or 5 people that just kind of, pushed hard as they saw me attack. I held it for, a little bit longer than a few seconds. In this case, I really wanted to see who was going to work. And as you can see, a couple riders came up behind me. We, pulled away about, 1 to 2 seconds off the main group. But again, started easing up and just kind of let everybody coast up to where I was at. And just, really, again, the goal for me was, can I get people to use their power-ups? And as you can see, 3 or 4 riders came past me with their draft bus. And that kind of always to me signals that, if you're using your power-ups in like inopportune times on the race, then you're probably hurting, and you're probably, or you're trying to save watts for a specific reason. And so if I can get you to use your power-up when it's least advantageous on a part like that, where we're going downhill, where, it doesn't make sense to use the draft power up, like on a long flat like this, sure, use your draft power up if you're hurting, if you're wanting to stay with the group, or even on a slight uphill. Because while this course, the uphill that we have is not steep enough to where the draft bus is gonna, is not gonna be impactful. It's just steep enough to where it's draftable, and if it's draftable, that means the draft bus can help. Now, as we get to the tunnel here, basically the same thing that we expected happened again. You see one person off the front, a couple more people start to go, and again, as I hit the base of the hill, I start to ramp up my watts in order to, and really the goal at this point was to stay with this group, not necessarily to push hard off the front. And, so as I do that, as I get to the top where, we've got a couple more riders, you see JD up front there. I basically was just like, all right, I stayed with the group. I didn't let myself fall behind. And so I, just basically settled in. Now, as we start to hit this uphill riser, I decide to launch yet another attack off the front. And boy, oh boy, was that fun. Because as you can see, we've got a couple people going at the same time. And so I've got this Galaxy rider that's right behind me that I thought was going to kind of stay on my wheel. But I decide I'm going to push all the way to the top of the hill as hard as I can. So I stay in the 4 watt per kilogram range. And you see a couple people coming up behind me and kind of staying on my wheel. But we're starting to build a gap from the group. We've got about a second or so. We're 3, 4 riders deep, and we've got a second off of, some other riders and 2 seconds back, basically from everybody else. And so I'm not, at this point, I'm still kind of holding a little bit of a hard pace. And really, the idea here was I wanted to stretch out the group as much as I can. And as you can see, everybody's coming up with their feathers. Now we are coming up to a sprint, and so for anyone who use their feather, it's essentially at the right time. Same thing with the draft bus. You're gonna get another power up as you go through this banner. And so as everyone starts to come around me, I give one more dig just so that way I don't fall too far off the back. Now I did let myself kind of fall a little bit too, let myself fall further back than I was comfortable with, because again, I wanted to make sure that I was available and help JD and Mike and any of the other dirt guys or painting guys that were in the group. And so I pushed to latch back on. I was kind of hoping that people were thinking that, all right, he's done, he's cooked, he's not going to be able to do anything else. And, the group really was pushing here. You can see as we start to, round the Arc de Triomphe, we are, everybody's stretched out. Like, it's single file and plenty of gaps between me and the very front rider. But ultimately, as we continue to round, go through the roundabout, we are all starting to come back together. There is one rider off the front, but not, ultimately not too worried about that rider at this moment. And so as we come down the bottom of the hill, I launch another attack just for the sake of launching another attack. Because again, my goal is to make this race as hard as possible. We did want to, when Mike and I spoke about it, our goal was to finish fast. And so I feel like me pushing as hard as I did helped keep the pace fast, helped keep as you can see, my average watts is in the 260s still. And, that was the goal for me, is to make this race fast. Now, as we get to the tunnel for the last time, this is where my strategy messed up. And so as you can see, I push off the front. You've got myself and a couple guys are really pushing hard, but everybody gave up. There is still some orange numbers, but I came out of the tunnel by far with the most power. I've still got a couple people on my wheel, less than a second behind me. But really it's just one other person that's less than a second behind me. I realize I pushed, a little too hard for, the guys that I was ultimately, working for, or, intending to work for. And so I, kind of ease back on the pedaling, let everybody come up and catch up. And so I wanted to, make sure that Mike or JD, were in this group. I'm seeing that, Mike just passed me. At the time I couldn't tell where JD was at, but then I saw his name. So I was like, all right, good. He's in this group. I started pushing up again because I didn't want to lose touch with this group. Cause I can see that basically, as soon as we get around this bend, this, S shape, people are going to start to launch, and then I see a guy go off the front. And so at that point I was like, all right, everybody's starting to pick up pace. Everybody's starting to go. So I, put in a little bit of a dig to get back on terms with this group. And as I start to get back on terms with them, I ease back up because, again, Mike and JD are still in here. And so I didn't want to push too hard since nobody else was really sprinting. I see another guy start to launch. And so that's when I start to push the watts up again. As you can see, I start to get into the 700-ish watts. And I'm trying to do my best to keep an eye on where Mike's at, trying to keep an eye on where JD's at. But, sprinting and trying to read the chart on the right-hand side is not really a good idea. And so at the time, I thought JD was already in front of me and I wasn't going to be able to essentially do anything for him. But looking back, I ended up realizing that I was actually in front of them for the first half of that sprint. And so I should have just kept going, and I actually should have pushed a lot harder because I still had some watts in me in order, in order to push. But because I thought they were in front of me and I wasn't, bridging up to them, to be able to help lead them out, I basically stopped. And so I let myself just kind of coast to the line from that point, and cross the line in 14th place. And, like I said, because this race was as fast as it was, it actually helped me out, GC wise, kind of helped me reverse what happened in stage two. But ultimately, my intention to be able to help them get a better placement on this stage didn't work out, just because the way I played my tactics at the end, the pushing hard and then stopping, pushing hard and then stopping, just really didn't do anything for me, didn't do anything for them. And so I told them the next race, I will definitely do better. Now, this is our club ladder race with the TFC Mercs. And last time we raced them, it was, we ended up, I think, losing by a point, because while we kind of overpowered them, I was in. So the spread of the group that we had didn't work out in our favor. So I was half points. Me and another rider were half points, and we basically took, I think, like first and second, something like that. And so our points really didn't help them out, or help us out. And so they ended up coming in like 2, 3, 4, 5, or 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. They basically came in all together. And so we, ultimately ended up losing to them by a point. And so this time around, we got a message from their team captain letting us know that, one of their big guys ended up having to drop out at the last minute. But even though they got a replacement for him, they fully expected us to kind of wipe the floor with them. And that was from him. And so, looking at the stage profile, I am, flat stage, I think we could have done a lot better than what we did. But this having a moderate climb, 5-6 minute effort climb in the middle, or at least not quite in the middle, but towards the end of the stage, I think that was going to make a big difference. And ultimately, for me, in my case, it really does end up making a big difference. But as we get rolling here, we're just kind of looking at kind of staying all together, keeping the guys together. And then, we'll start launching our attacks when we feel like, we can really position ourselves well. Now, as we get to this bridge, we're really we're only a couple minutes into the stage. And as you can see from the message, Deadpool has his, he's having issues, and he's getting dropouts. And so he's about 5 seconds behind, which is unfortunate. One of our guys had already launched an attack, and he's kind of pushing off the front. And so they're, everybody's kind of pushing to, cover that attack. And, you've got the TFC, essentially team captain, is off the back and not able to catch back on because of technical issues. And so we're just, at this point, we're kind of, we're watching where he's at, but at the same time, we are, not letting ourselves, just fall back. I fully expected them to, want to slow the pace down or maybe send a guy back in order to, bring him up. I thought about, easing back a little bit because technical issues are never fun. And so I figured, I was like, if I ease back a little bit, give him an opportunity to catch back up. But he was a little bit further back than I was going to let myself fall back to in order to help him out. Because again, this is a race at the end of the day. Now, another one of their guys ended up having a dropout. Now, he kind of literally looked like he hit the brakes. His avatar basically came to a stop and blew past us, going backwards. And so you see their team captain's like, hey, can we go neutral for a little bit? And so we were talking about that on our chat. Their guys are still pushing a little bit hard. And so the person that dropped out, he ends up messaging like, hey, I'm back on. Don't worry about it. And so we just kept going. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering why I'm wearing a polka dot jersey, is because I decided to do a climb portal right before this race. And so I did the Col de Bretagne, and yeah, ended up getting the KOM because nobody else was on the climb with me, which is totally fine. But what happened with the Allez race, I completely burnt myself out on that climb portal, and now I'm struggling just to keep up. And so that was a absolutely stupid decision on my part to, do a climb portal at 125%, where the middle of the climb goes from like 10% to 14, and then 17, and then 20 something percent. I think it maxed at like 20 or 22%. Now my trainer does go up to I think my trainer maxes out at 22%, and so I was spinning at like 40 something RPMs, just trying to get myself out of that, out of that portion of the climb portal. And so as you can see, I'm basically back on at this point, but I am hurting. My legs are hurting. I am, not quite out of energy, but I definitely know that I set myself up for failure, especially when it came to the climb itself. So as I come up to the group, I end up pushing through, just to kind of keep the pace going. Now they do have a couple guys that were starting to fall off the back a little bit, and so I wanted to make sure I did my part to keep the pace going, so that way, as their guys are falling off the back, we can create enough of a gap, from us, that they're either going to work harder to catch up
as we hit the
or
base
they're going to
of
continue
the
falling off the
aqueduct
back. KOM, I am, kind of holding on. I pushed a little bit, prior to the start of the KOM, so to kind of push the pace up. We kind of figured that their rider is a little bit more of a climber, and so you can see he's kind of pushing off the front. Now he did end up using his ghost, which was, uh, for us, we're kind of like, okay, where's he at? Where's he at? Who sees him? I'm starting to fall off the back, significantly. They have a couple riders that fell off the back already, which are 13 seconds behind me. Now, I did not want to let myself, get caught by them, and so I gave a good push to get over the top. And as I'm watching our guys kind of push forward and slip away a little bit, at this point, I'm thinking like, all right, I've got to bridge this gap, because if I don't, I'm gonna get caught, and I'm gonna end up in a position where I'm gonna cost our team some points, unintentionally. And it really is because I over overdid it with the climb portal, and so I give another dig as I get to the back half of the aqueduct KOM. And by the way, I'm on the Athos and the NV65s. So I'm on my climbing bike, which actually functioned really well on this stage. I didn't feel like it was as bad as it could have been. Even though it's not meant to be a fast bike, or super aerodynamic. What I mean by fast bike, it's not meant to be super aerodynamic, but with those DT65s, it was pretty good. It's pretty good, I gotta say. And as you can see, so the guys are encouraging me on Discord, like, hey, keep pushing. We're 10 seconds back, 9 seconds. I'm starting to close that gap. Just keep pushing. Make sure that you don't let yourself kind of fall behind. I know that I can push my 20-minute powers in the like 3-1, 3-2 range. Not quite 3-2, but I think 3-1. So I know I can push in that 3-4 to 3-5 range for a few minutes. And that's really all I need, in order to, get back on terms with the group. Right now I'm down to about 7 seconds. And so I give myself another dig and kind of push harder into the, 4 or 5 watts per kilogram. And just kind of, at this point I'm playing with the gears, kind of, jumping up and, doing the best that I can to push hard, not necessarily sprint, but push hard. And so I'm starting to get back on with them. I'm 4 seconds back, and they're, again, encouraging me, just keep going. Because that ultimately led, that gave me the ability to create enough of a gap between me and the riders behind me, that they're now, 24 and 34 seconds behind me. So as I get, to this group, you see one of our guys, dropped off the back enough to where, I can catch him and draft, and then, bridge up to the rest of the group. Now I start to coast and ended up, ultimately coasting well past, not well past this group, but, coasting up to the front of this group. And as you can see, and that's why I said this, the Athos with the DT65s are a pretty good combination, because, as I stop pedaling, it's still, with the draft that let me coast right through these guys without losing too much momentum there. And so I used my draft bus because I was absolutely exhausted at this point. Trying, bridging that, 10 plus second gap after the Aqueduct KOM, and then coming up to the Petite KOM. I was like, all right, I know I've got, another dig that I can do before I get to, before we get to the climb, because, as we're coming up to the climb, we see that one of their guys is, pushing and closing that gap, and he really is, working hard to close that gap. So we didn't want to let him get too close, because we knew that if we could get to the base of the climb and, keep enough of a gap, then, we can, go up the climb as a group and really hold him back from, being able to catch us, and ultimately maximizing our points through to this climb. So I'm going to go ahead and forward this to the base of the. Now, as we hit the climb here, you can see a little bit of shenanigans going on, people going left and right. And so I start to, basically settle in for this 4, 5, 6 minute climb. At this point, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do, but I know that it's going to hurt because I'm already sore. Their rider that's behind me has closed the gap to about 15 seconds. We were able to kind of hold him at that point. And as you can see, my brakes come on because my left controller is completely going haywire. So I go into my settings. Now, this is a PSA for anyone that does ladder racing. Everyone's always told me, hey, disable your brakes, turn off your brakes. And as you can see, as I get back into the climb, the TFC rider that was 15 seconds back is now 5 seconds ahead of me. All because my brakes was on. Now, I usually keep my braking sensitivity at like 50%, because instances where I roll off the front, I want to be able to control my momentum and kind of keep myself from going too far ahead. Same thing like when I'm riding with the pacer bots, I will use my brakes to stay within that 40-meter gap, so that way I can stay with the pacer bot. Now, as you can see, my gearing is going haywire now. Instead of just braking, my gearing is basically manually it's shifting down on its own to gear 1, and so I ended up having to shut off my left controller because it just was completely uncooperative. And so when I shut off my left controller, I lost even more time to the rider in front of me. He's now 17 seconds ahead of me, and so I've only got essentially the ability to shift up. So I've got to measure myself and my performance as best as possible. I'm in gear 7 right now. I feel good. I know that I can push a little bit harder, but I also want to stay, in a range where I can, maintain the mid threes, 3.5 watts per kilogram, on the harder part of the climbs, and then kind of spin faster in the, flatter parts to kind of keep my momentum. I start to, the rider in front of me is, pulling away a little bit. He's at, 18, 19 seconds ahead of me. And I'm thinking at this point, like, all right, I need to really work on closing that gap. And I also want to make sure that the rider behind me, whose name is starting to just pop up on, on the board there, is not catching up to me. And so they're about, I've got two riders 5 and 7 seconds behind me. And I want to make sure that I stay ahead of them, because if they catch me, then now the points, now becomes an issue with points. They've got one rider way off the back. We've got one rider, not necessarily way off the back, but far back enough to where it could make a big difference points wise. Because right now, one of their guys is off the front and really just has a commanding lead off the front. He's about a minute ahead of where I'm at. We've got one rider that's not too far from him, or three riders rather, not too far from him. And so we've got good standings in terms of points, but that, the rider ahead of me, I'm doing my best to close that gap. But the rider behind me ultimately, closes that gap enough to where, he ends up catching me. And, in spite of my, trying to push as hard as I can, and I really did feel like this was my best performance on this climb. I was holding, in the upper threes for the upper threes, low fours for the harder parts of the climb. And then as I got to the flatter parts, I would, push a little bit harder and kind of stay in the mid threes to low threes, because I knew that's where I could comfortably climb at for a good period of time. Because that's what I just did on the climb portal that I was on, which again, probably a mistake if doing a climb portal right before a team event. And so I'm, continuing to hold my pace, continuing to hold the gap on the rider behind me, and just doing the absolute best I can to not lose any, not lose any momentum here. But at the same time, you can see my heart rate's in the 180s, and I am starting to feel it. I'm starting to fade little by little. You can see I kind of paused there for a second, and let my pedaling kind of slow down enough to where it ultimately ends up allowing the rider behind me to really close that gap significantly. And so as we hit this middle part of the climb, I'm thinking like, all right, I can, I've got to push it hard on this part of the climb. I shift up, some more gears, go into gear 11, and I get out of the saddle, but I feel like gear 11 was not the right gear to be out of the saddle. And so I end up sitting back down, and it didn't feel comfortable sitting. It didn't feel comfortable standing. And so the rider behind me is, really closing that gap, but the rider behind him is now starting to fade little by little, which I was perfectly okay with, because that meant, even if they're one rider past me, we essentially have, they have three riders in front of me. We have three riders in front of me. But the three riders that we have in front of me are all in, 2, 3, 4 in terms of placement if they all cross the line in the position that they're in. And really now the two riders that are in front of me weren't going to catch our guys. Like, our guys are, 45 plus seconds ahead of them. And so at this point, I see he passes me, and I'm looking to make sure that I don't lose his wheel. He is, gaining some ground on me. He's about 5 seconds ahead of me. But I know that if I can just hold a good pace, especially up this last part of the climb, then, he won't get too far away from me. And as long as he doesn't get too far away from me, then the rider behind me, that means the rider behind me is not going to catch up. You see that person is about 12 seconds back, while the rider in front of me is about 7 seconds, and kind of, I'm maintaining that, that little bit of a gap, 7, 8 seconds, and just making sure that I don't fall too far behind. So again, I, push up again to gear 13 because I want to be able to climb, and now I'm 14. I want to be able to climb as hard as I can through the last part of this, KOM. So I'm holding, mid fours, 4-4, 4-5, 4-6, a little bit until 4-7 for a second there. And as I hit this flat part, I let my watts come down, let my legs rest for a second, and then, do it all over again in order to, get through this last corner, which really is the corner that for me is always the hardest. Because as you get here, I feel like for me, I'm always, at the limit of my effort, because this is a really good 5-minute effort climb. And so I always try and push as hard as I can. I'm always trying to, bring up my 5-minute power, but ultimately, end up not able to, close that gap enough. And so as I hit as I pass the KOM and hit the top of this, of this false flat, the rider's got about 8 seconds ahead of me. I've got, the rider behind me 12 seconds back. And so again, at this point, I've got to stay as far away from the person behind me as possible, and do my best to close that gap to the person in front of me. So they've got 10 seconds right now. Obviously they're on the downhill, so they're going to be picking up momentum. You can see by their power, they're still pushing, still pushing watts. And so I'm doing my best to push a little more watts and, gain as much momentum, especially on this, this 3%, part of the hill. And I'm waiting till I get to the steepest part so I can ease off a little bit and let myself get into the super tuck, because You know, there is some benefit to being in the super tuck. You know, you get some free rest, you get some free speed, but on this descent, there are parts where it starts to ease off and flatten out. And so if you're not paying attention, you will end up losing some time and momentum. As you can see, my speed drops from, 67 kilometers an hour to sub 60 kilometers an hour. And so I start to pedal again because the hill's at minus 2%. And so I start to pedal again so that way I can get past this point. And get to the steeper parts and above the 57 kilometers an hour in order to super tuck and let myself kind of get into that position again at 65 kilometers an hour in order to just keep pushing. But again, it's the slope starts to ease off, my momentum starts to slow down, and so I've got to kick it over again. I've got, I didn't really close enough of a gap. I've got 9 seconds, still holding 9-10 seconds to the rider in front of me. We've got about little under 2.5 kilometers left. I'm thinking at this point, can I close this gap? Can I really, get to this rider and do my best to try and pass them? And as you can see, I turned on my left paddle just to shift the gears down a bit because I wanted to have a little bit more control. I didn't want to hit the flats in gear 18 or whatever I was in when I was pushing downhill. And so I turned the left controller on for a moment so it can shift down and then shut it back off. And so I'm in gear 11 right now, just kind of coasting. I've got about 9 seconds on the rider in front of me, or he's got about 9 seconds on me. And so as I start to get to the bottom here, I'm thinking, all right, 1.5 kilometers. If I really push it hard on the last kilometer and kind of, do one of my long range sprints, maybe I'll be able to close that gap. But, if they've got enough energy in energy in their legs, then they're not going to let that happen. And so as, I get this one little final super tuck in to rest for a second there, as I start to come down to this, to the flat part of the stage and closing into about 1 kilometer left, I know that I'm either going to have to work really hard to catch this rider or keep pushing so I don't get caught. And ultimately, that's what I kind of decided. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to keep pushing harder so I don't get caught. Our guys are already, done with the race or finishing with the race right now. Again, their 2 riders ahead of me aren't going to catch our front guys. And so I'm not really worried about points at this point. I'm just worried about not getting caught. And so we've got 700 meters to go. I start to push a little more. I wanted to see if I could close a little bit more of that gap and get closer. Not that it would matter anyways, because with ladder racing, it doesn't matter what time you finish. It ultimately only matters what placement you finish, is what points you get for your placement. And so, I did want it to give it, its fair effort. But I was absolutely exhausted at this point. Absolutely exhausted. Had no business doing a climb portal before this race. But ultimately, our team did end up riding a good race and finishing in a position where we could take the points to win. And so as I crossed the line, in my mind, was kind of mentally assessing what the points would be. And so I knew that, hey, we were going to make it across. No big deal. We were going to, we were going to get the points that we needed. So coasted across the line and felt good. Absolutely good. Exhausted, but it was a good finish at the end of the day. And it was great racing with these guys. The TFC Mercs are a strong group. As you can see, the rider that, finished first, the CISO Iceman TFC, great riding, good power, really good power at the end. Our guys were pretty impressed with, the kind of power he was putting out for the last handful of minutes or so on this race, which ultimately is the reason why he finished 20-something seconds ahead of our guys. But ultimately, we got the, getting 2, 3, 4, and then 7 for me. And then I think 9 was our last guy that came in. That put us in a position where we could essentially maximize the points that we were able to get. and ultimately allowed us to win this race. So I will leave you there. Hope you learned something about my mistakes and the things not to do in racing or before racing that could affect your race performance. And I will catch you guys on the next race. Hey guys, it's Miguel from That Thing You Just Watched. Hope you enjoyed that video, whether it was topic on nutrition or racing or a combination of both. Feel free to come back. I will continue to put out videos like this and continue to showcase what you can do with smart nutritional strategies, combining that with racing, because that is what this channel is all about. And feel free to check in if you want to see more racing. Click on wherever the link's at, subscribe, and I will catch you guys on the next race.